Well, hello everybody. Thank you very much for coming. It feels like we've had at least 2 or 3 terms already this term. We've had so many events, and we're really delighted. We're on a roll here at the Life Writing Centre. This is the part 2 of On Life Writing, but really the 2 talks stand alone because last week I explored completely different issues with Erika Boehmer, thinking about fact versus fiction and what the truth pact is between writer and reader. And today, Hermione and I will be talking about something completely different, How Close is Too Close, which is a title we rather like.
Kate's title. I have to admit, I wanted to claim it for myself, but Kate brilliantly came up with How Close is Too Close.
I think we co-own it now.
Oh, okay. So we're going to talk about biography and other kinds of life writing, but in terms of, how close should you get, or how close can you get? And I think you and I could sort of symbolically be seen as standing at opposite ends of this spectrum.
Yes.
At least at the moment. So Kate's going to talk about the ways in which she involves herself in her story, or at least the most recent story that you've been telling. Whereas I am representing an unfriendly, austere, bad-tempered view of writing biography, where you don't put yourself in the story, however much your publishers might want you to do so. And we might come back to that. But I quite like kind of coming in at the beginning, just to sort of set up the challenges, as it were, of the challenges of writing the book, and then disappearing, and then coming back at the end, and giving you a look, as it were. And I need a long session of psychoanalysis to understand quite why I'm so resistant to saying I all the time in a biographical story. I think it must have a lot to do with my upbringing and my Oxford education in the 60s, and the kinds of biographies I grew up reading, where no one would have dreamed of saying I. But I'm also rather influenced by Virginia Woolf, who had a horror, actually, of saying I. So she said I all the time in her diaries, of course, but not in her published work. And she said one instead, and then got into terrible trouble for sounding so snooty. But a room of one's own is partly a way of not saying I. And she had a horror of what she called the damned egotistical self. And she didn't like it to obtrude into the fiction. There's a very strange phrase she uses about writing essays, where she says she likes to have a veil, a kind of veil between the self and the essay. And the veil actually takes the form of style, or form, or shape, so that it's not just you talking at your reader. And I'm also influenced by one of my beloved subjects, Penelope Fitzgerald, an English novelist of great genius, who used to say, I don't want to insult the reader by explaining too much, as a result of which her books were quite short. In fact, her publisher was saying, can you make them a bit longer? Because there's lots in here we don't really understand. And she said, nope. And there's a wonderful biography she wrote of her father and her uncles. They were a famous intellectual family called the Knoxes. Ronald Knox, Dilwyn Knox, who worked at Bletchley. Her father was editor of Punch. And it's called the Knox Brothers, and they're her family. She's not in the book. Every so often she mentions the niece. That's her, and she's not in the index. And so trying to find Penelope Fitzgerald in that book is like trying to get invisible ink to come up through the page. So those are my sort of mentors. But Kate, you're in a different place, at least at the moment.
I'm in a conflicted place because Hermione is my mentor. So
up to a point.
Entirely. So I've written biography in which I am entirely absent. In fact, interestingly, even more absent than you. But my most recent biography relies on me as the narrator and my own personal story to set the hairs running. And that was very squeamish for me, very much out of the Hermione Oxford box. And so that's been very interesting to think about. So how I've made that transition, why that needed to happen with this particular project, and under what circumstances would I come out from behind the curtain and talk about myself. And I think we all suffer from the tremendous English aversion to self-publicity, self-aggrandizement, or in any way, just assuming you're interesting enough for anyone to care about you, which, as you say, is probably a therapist's dream, and we could spend a lot of money on. But in my case, the book Cello, A Journey Through Silence to Sound, as if in its paperback, which came out last year, comes from a personal impetus to want to write this story. There are so many reasons why we choose our subjects, why they speak to us, why we're given a subject, why a subject emerges from our PhD or whatever it happens to be, we're commissioned. But this was an attempt for me to reconcile my ridiculously bizarre CV as a professional cellist and a life writer in English, to think about what would happen if I put my life writer's hat on a cello, so to speak, and how we can use an instrument as an object that holds life stories and holds the voice of a player. And I was particularly interested in what happens when that relationship is complicated between this wooden body double and the person who lives with it and touches it more than any other human being. And the reason why I wanted to write this story was because, although I do play professionally, I injured my arm permanently quite early on in my career, and I have at times been silenced, and I have at times found sound. And so what I wanted to do was to use that as my calling card, in a way, to draw around me a whole constellation of other musicians who had been silenced, and to think about voice and silence and gaps in stories and erased lives and all the kinds of things that we're really interested in here. And so there was a very, very clear rationale and a structural imperative for me to have to start my own story. And I don't know that I would have been able to do it if that hadn't been the case. And I was pushed and pushed and pushed by my lovely editor, who I trust implicitly, to reveal more and more. And it was the only bit of the book that we went over quite a few times, with him sending it back, going, no, more. How did it feel? How did it feel? And it was difficult. I don't normally struggle to write, and it was hard to be so sort of soul-bearing. But you need to care for about 440 pages about these cellos. And so you need to know why I care. And so if I don't tell you enough about why I care, I'm not starting with a big enough jump to keep the impetus through the rest of the book.
Can you read a bit?
Yes.
Yes.
Just to say, it's not all about me at all. I use myself as, you follow my adventures. I take my cello right around Europe, through every possible country you can think of, with innumerable language issues. And you follow my journeys, but it's only really at the beginning that I actually tell you why I'm on this quest.
And it is an absolutely thrilling journey, which takes Kate to all kinds of extraordinary people and places, and it's tremendously moving. And I can witness that it's not an ego trip.
It gets better when it's not about me. Where are we? Prelude. What better instrument than a cello, half thunder, half prayer, to listen to the world? But what if that instrument falls silent? When I was 15, I won a scholarship to study at Wells Cathedral School, a specialist music school in Somerset. It meant swapping my inner city home for medieval architecture and surrounding myself with some of the best young players of my generation. I had wanted to be a cellist for as long as I could remember, and this was the nearest I could get to heaven. I sat in my practice room for hours, with the sounds of my friends hammering away at pianos and virtuosic string studies mingling in the central staircase. I got up at 6 a.m. to play scales, practiced at lunchtime, and returned to my cello after lessons. After a year or so, as my stamina improved, I played for longer and longer. I attempted harder repertoire, mastering as many concertos as I could. In my practice room, I discovered the fireworks of Dvorak, the frenetic drive and nerviness of Shostakovich, and the melancholy of Bloch. But above all, I fell deeply and forever in love with the Elgar's cello concerto, the breathless hush of its slow movement and the lonely solemnity of the great melody of the first movement. I had entered a world in which I knew I belonged, and I never wanted to leave. One evening, a year later, as I was preparing for a major competition, I pushed myself too far. I was playing some demanding study involving endless trills, working my weaker fourth and fifth fingers too hard, when something felt as if it had snapped in my forearm, and I felt a burning pain shoot down between wrist and elbow. At first, I was simply shocked. When it hadn't got better after a day or two, I started to panic. When, many weeks later, I still could not write or play, I was thin to the point of anorexia and numb with frustration. The school sent me to all the specialists they could, but no one offered a conclusive diagnosis or any treatment that proved effective. In the meantime, the months passed. I spent the days sitting in lessons, unable to write, and the evenings wandering the cobbled streets of Wells like a ghost, my arm in a sling. The concerto opportunities, recitals, and competitions I'd been preparing for came and went. Although I could not play, I still had to find something to do with the hours of practice time allotted to me as a music student. I would take my cello to my usual practice room and sit with it, placing my copy of the Bach cello suites on the stand in front of me. Just looking at the music for the Elgar made me want to cry, so that stayed firmly in my music case. But Bach was different. In silence, I imagined exactly how it would feel to play each note, what bowing patterns I would choose, whether one note would have more or less stress than another, where the emphases fell in each phrase. This fantastical music making, dipping in and out of silence, my silence, seemed to lend itself perfectly only to the Bach suites. When I tried it with a sonata, it felt more like a one-way conversation. Each silent suite was real to me, and after a few weeks of this eccentric practicing, I could, had I been able to, have played most of them from memory. When I wasn't sitting with my instrument, I was punishing myself for my own stupidity. My technique had probably not been secure enough for the demands I was placing on it, and I had never heard of tendinitis. But now it was too late. What was I if I wasn't a cellist? It was the quality that defined me, my one calling card. I lost so much weight I was made to attend weekly weigh-ins with a school nurse, which I got round by filling my pockets with stones in advance. Each week I simply added another stone or two. It's not a problem now. I don't need to do that. We've just been eating Kit Kats. My subterfuge didn't work for very long. Eventually my parents were summoned to be told I needed to be hospitalised, and I realised I had to make a decision. I decided to live, even if that meant a future without my cello. I did eventually manage to continue to study the cello, and I play professionally, although the struggle with my injury continues and is a constant limitation. As I recovered a little of the use of my arm, with a combination of physiotherapy and rest, I found that I could build up my stamina very gradually by playing early music that made fewer demands on my permanently weak arm. So I performed on a Baroque cello, foregoing the romantic and 20th century repertoire that I had loved. But the limitations my injury imposed have forced me to explore other ways to express my passion for music, and for that I'm grateful. I've written books and opera libretti, talk about music on the radio and concert platforms, but what I haven't ever done until now is try to understand my complicated relationship with the instrument that was my first love.
Oh, that's wonderful. Really nice. And actually very painful to hear, and wonderful that this book itself was a kind of rescue operation that you did on yourself. But also so interesting, the question of identity, how do we, which plays through all this conversation really, what are we, how are we identifying ourselves? And you have the luck also, the terrible bad luck there, but also the luck of being able to identify yourself as a writer and a teacher as well as a cellist. So, when going back from that, which is very autobiographical and necessarily so, as you rightly said, because if we don't have that story, we really can't understand the nature of the quest and why you needed to make it. But for me, it's more like a sort of an afterglance, a sort of commentary on, like an afterword, or
you frame your narratives. You think
it's more like a frame. So maybe we can have an echo reading. So this is just the the last bit, a little bit of the last bit of this long book on Virginia Woolf, which I published in 1996, so it's nearly 30 years ago, and reading this, going back to this, which I don't very often, does feel like a very long time ago, and some of this now feels quite quaintly historical. So this last section is called Biographer. I was born 3 years after the end of the war and 7 years after Virginia Woolf's death. I grew up in a literary household which had all her books. I can't remember not having heard of her. When I was 8 or 9, I went away on a visit. This was rather unusual for me, and stayed the night with friends. There was one book on the table by my bed. It was the 1951 orange penguin edition of The Waves. And I vividly remember starting to read the first few pages without understanding much of what was going on and feeling as if I had happened on a secret language which belonged to me. It was part of the excitement of being away from home on my own. This was my discovery. I didn't get very far, and I don't remember my subsequent return to the novel, but that sense of a secret discovery remained with me and left an echo track in later readings. As a child growing up in London in the 1950s and 1960s, I lived in Virginia Woolf's urban landscape. By the time I came to Oxford in the mid-1960s, I had started to read some of her novels. She was not studied in my Oxford English course. At graduate level, she was described to me by my tutor as a minor modernist, not to be classed with Joyce, Eliot, or Lawrence. Since then, I have been reading a Virginia Woolf who has greatly changed. She has changed from the Virginia Woolf who died in 1941, or the Virginia Woolf whose writer's diary in 1953 seemed so aesthetically intense, so painfully serious and driven, or the Virginia Woolf of Quentin Bell's 1972 biography, eccentric genius, brilliant comic aunt, enchanting friend. She herself was intensely aware from her own reading and theorizing of biography of how lives are changed in retrospect. As she said of Shelley, there are some stories which have to be retold by each generation. And her story is reformulated by each generation. She takes on the shape of difficult modernist preoccupied with questions of form, or comedian of manners, or neurotic highbrow aesthete, or inventive fantasist, or pernicious snob, or Marxist feminist, or historian of women's lives, or victim of abuse, or lesbian heroine, or cultural analyst, depending on who is reading her and when and in what context. Because of these reappropriations, she seems to us now, I'm writing 30 years ago, both a contemporary and a historical figure. But she speaks to us of issues and concerns which are vital to us and are not yet resolved. But she is also a late Victorian, bringing into her work the concerns and mental habits of a previous century. When I set out on my biographer's journey in 1991, the paradoxical nearness and distance of Virginia Woolf struck me very strongly. The archives still reflect the early arrangements made after her death and bear traces of Leonard Woolf's attempt to deal with the complicated chaos of her papers and his piece-by-piece selling off of her manuscripts and diaries. That could be a whole book in itself. Many of her friends and acquaintances still live, I wrote in the early 90s, though some have died while I've been working on this book. They have been telling their Virginia Woolf stories for over 50 years, and mostly committed to paper and hardened into irrefrangible form. I often felt, as I went on my well-trodden rounds, to be met on the whole with kind but wearied civility, how impertinent it was to reduce other people's long histories, often very distinguished histories, to their moments of knowledge of this one famous person, as though the rest of their lives counted for nothing. And I was also, by the way, very aware as I went round to see all these people, all of whom have now died, that the minute I'd gone out of the room, they would be picking up the phone and saying, there's another one just come round. She doesn't seem too insane this time. There's quite a lot of Woolfians going round the trail. Yet even so, I felt occasionally that there were new things to hear, a fresh detail to be glimpsed. These interviews made me feel I was moving towards the life of a person which was at once locked in past, distant history and touchably close. I have the same kind of feeling about her work. Though much of it is monumentally established in the canon of modernism and feminism, a great part of it too is still underread and undervalued. Virginia Woolf as an author will go on changing. The places she lived in and visited embody my sense of her as at once distant and close. It is still possible to see and do some of what she did. Though her city of London was bombed out of recognition, you can still go to St Paul's or walk along the river. You can wander through Kew Gardens or up Richmond Hill or dine at the Ivy or go to a concert at the Wigmore Hall or hear Wagner at Covent Garden at a price. You can still take Mrs. Brown's train from Richmond to Waterloo, and you are as likely as Virginia Woolf was to see beggar women with mongrel dogs in Kingsway or on the Strand. Her own places have had a mixed afterlife. Charleston has been rescued from decay by the family and the friends of Charleston and attracts hundreds of visitors. Monk's House is now a neatly kept museum owned by the National Trust. The ashes are in the garden under the Tomlin bust. The writing lodge is in its place by the church wall. In St Ives, Talent House, her childhood summer home, brought back to life into the lighthouse, stands surrounded on all sides by hotels and villas, but with a bit of garden left. It has had an ugly extension added on the roof and has been converted into holiday flats. The first person to do this, I heard from a St Ives bookseller, was a little unsure of the history of the house, but thought it would be a good move to benefit from it, and so put up a sign which read, Talent House, home of Virginia Woolf, wife of the famous novelist. Then the house was sold to a couple who told me infuriatedly that when they bought it, they had, quote, never heard of the bloody woman, but soon realised their mistake. Every time you turn round, there's Americans in the living room, Australians in the bathroom. The owner would not let me into the house, but he did allow me into the grounds. Enough remains of the enclosed strip of garden to suggest the past. There is an escalonia hedge, which plays a great part in her memoirs, and there is a view. I stand in the garden feeling like a biographer, a tourist, and an intruder. It is getting dark. I inspect the stone step below the French window where the Stephen family and their guests were so often photographed. No convenient ghost is going to appear, casting her shadow on the step. However, looking away from the house, over the buildings of the 20th century, at the distant view from this island lookout, I can allow myself to suppose that I am seeing something of what she saw. My view overlays with, just touches hers. The view, in fact, seems to have been written by Virginia Woolf. The lighthouse beam strikes round, the waves break on the shore. So I wanted to get a sense of her being sort of feeling close to me and at the same time a long way away, and the points at which biography can just find that overlapping point, which other biographers have written. I mean, Richard Holmes has written beautifully about how being a biographer is like trying to cross the broken bridge at Avignon. You know, you can go so far, but there is still that gap. And that, of course, involves the whole question of objectivity and how personal we can be and how much we stand back from our subject and how much we allow ourselves to get involved.
But so that image of the overlaying, that your view could touch hers, you're not claiming to see what she saw or be able to interpret it in the same way, but that something about your gaze touches the gaze that she had in that space.
Which is why one of the jobs of biography, as we obviously both feel, and I think a lot of people feel, is that you do need to go to the places. You do need to do the footsteps operation, even if the places have radically changed, because something happens when you just see a view or a bit of landscape, or there'll be something there that is kind of, you're trying to see what they saw, and I think that is very important.
Whereas you would go through that process but embed your thoughts and your observations and your feelings about the place into your writing, whereas my methodology in Cello is to describe what I'm seeing and think about what's changed, but do it through the lens of the present, yes. Observing the past.
Yes. Go on to then talking a bit about this whole question of, you know, how much we put ourselves in the story and why we want to write about ourselves if we do. I mean, that would be switching perhaps a little bit more towards the memoir side of of life writing, or the autobiographical side of life writing?
Yes, why we write about ourselves at all, perhaps. Montaigne said, there are many things that I would not care to tell any individual man that I tell to the public. And I think that writing yourself is always more than just writing the story. And we have to think about why we write. George Orwell, in 1936, in an essay called Why We Write, talks about writing through sort of unashamed, unabashed egotism. That's his primary reason for writing. But we might write to be remembered. We might write to get our own back on those who snubbed us in earlier life or tried to define us. We might want to feel heard. We might write to shock. We write perhaps to justify ourselves, or as a bid for admiration or for sympathy, as a desire to reveal hypocrisy and redefine what's shocking. We write perhaps for catharsis, and there's an element of that in Cello, perhaps. And writing so often is therapy, and that's an interesting line that we tread quite carefully here at the Life Writing Centre, because we're not therapists, we're not offering life writing as a form of therapy, and yet it is a hugely cathartic, therapeutic activity when you are able to shape a version of yourself on the page and perhaps change something in creating that iteration of yourself, so write yourself into definition. However, the Welsh novelist Bernice Rubens, who won the Booker Prize, wrote of one of her novels that it was good therapy for me, but a rotten novel. You should always write in yesterday's blood, which is rather a nice phrase, I think. I think there is a danger in writing about ourselves, that we become the story. And of course, if you are writing a confessional memoir, if you're writing a book that sets out to be about yourself, that's absolutely what you do. The difficulty for us to navigate is how much we balance ourself and our perspective with the subject, and at what point we overshadow our subject, or at what point our observations about our subject are useful and informative and will deepen and complicate and nuance the picture of this other person we're trying to tell.
And just to follow on, as it were, in brackets from that, I'm very fascinated by the sort of hidden ways, or sometimes even perhaps the unconscious ways, in which we pretend to objectivity when we're writing a biography. But of course, we all write from our own position. We write from our education, our gender, our race, our class, and we often write reactively. I mean, I think it's different when you're writing a first biography of someone, as I have done a couple of times. You're in a different kind of zone there, where you're trying to be you've taken on a big responsibility, and you're trying to be as true to the task as you can. Obviously, that would apply throughout, but you're not, as it were, writing against or in the light of other people. Whereas I think quite often, if you're writing about, Virginia Woolf or Edith Wharton, you are very conscious of the ways in which that person has been written about before. And although I think it's a mistake to turn biography into a kind of argument with previous biographers, or and I've known biographies that do this. So it's saying, excuse me, mine's the best. Nobody's ever done this before. There's quite a lot of that in biography.
You are at the very least standing on their shoulders, aren't you?
Yeah, you have to be aware of what you're reacting against, I think. And,
so would there be an argument then, perversely, that you, Hermione Lee, what do you bring to the party of Woolf biographers past? Would there be an argument for coming out more when you write a biography of someone like Woolf, where people know the facts?
I think, well, in my view, it can be implicit in the way you're treating it. You don't have to say, this is what I intend to do because this is what people have done before, because I think that's boring. But obviously what I was trying to do at that time, in the early 90s, she had been, in the 80s, been treated very much as a victim figure. And there was a whole wave of psychotherapeutic writing about particularly female subjects, and particularly people subject to depression and who ended their own lives. And so that sense of everything inevitably leading to the point of her suicide was something that I was really trying to resist, and wanted to think about her actually as an enormously energetic, courageous, professional, noticing, observant person, bringing the world in, instead of this person who sometimes is thought of as this rather frail, narcissistic, private and vulnerable person. So that would have been, but I didn't want to put that in the book. I just wanted to write the book to show that.
Become true by reading it.
But go back, Kate, to where you think people have done well with this business of self-involvement.
Yes, and, how much to put yourself in, and when it's actually useful, when it drives the narrative and offers a useful commentary. Well, for instance, Anna Funder, who wrote wonderful Stasi-Land about Berlin pre the fall of the wall, who was a visiting scholar here at the centre. She wrote this book before she came to us. This is her first book, but it's one kind of everything going, basically. It's a fantastic, fantastic book. And Anna is Australian. She is a journalist. And it is told from her point of view. So she didn't live through the fall of the Berlin Wall. She didn't live in Berlin before the wall fell. But what she does do, having been posted to Berlin, is to put an advert in a newspaper and find people who were members of the Stasi or people who had rebelled against the Stasi regime, and interviews them. And she uses her outsider status very usefully, because as an Australian, as a journalist, as someone coming in as an observer, we can use her gaze to examine these different stories that she discovers and puts in front of us. But what she also does really interestingly from the very beginning is kind of bake a sense of atmosphere of the place into her own personal experience, her own feelings. So she is able to tell us about Berlin in 1996 when she's there, through her own bodily feelings, her emotions, her experience, without actually spelling any of it out. So just to give you a sense of the kind of dour bleakness of it, the very first page, I am hungover and steer myself like a car through the crowds at Alexanderplatz station. Several times I miscalculate my width, scraping into a bin and an advertising bollard. Tomorrow's bruises will develop on my skin like a picture from a negative. A man turns from the wall, smiling and zipping up his fly. He is missing shoelaces and some teeth. His face and his shoes are as loose as each other. Another man in overalls, with a broom the size of a tennis court sweeper, pushes disinfectant pellets along the platform. He makes arcs of green powder and cigarette butts and urine. A morning drunk walks on the ground like it might not hold him. And so it goes on. So we know we can almost smell where she is through her own physical experience and through what she observes.
Like a film, isn't it?
Absolutely, absolutely. And it would be hard to achieve that, or at least you'd have to achieve it differently if we weren't clearly being directed through her eyes.
But it also raises quite challenging questions about whether it's okay to write about a particularly difficult and dark period of a country's history when you are not part of that country. I mean, I think that's very complicated, and I haven't seen the reviews. I know she's been incredibly much praised for this book, but I can imagine one could take an attitude which would say, well, this is all very well, but here you've popped in and had a look and written up your experiences and off you go again.
Yeah, and which both she and I have written about the Holocaust, and that's, I mean, self-evidently an incredibly difficult topic. I'm not Jewish. I wasn't there. What right do I have to say anything about it at all? And in fact, I think when you looked at my very, very, very first ungainly draft, sprawling across too many pieces of paper, that was one of the things that you said that was incredibly helpful, was that you took out every bit of sentiment in anything I said, so I couldn't emote. And I found that an extremely useful guiding principle. It was almost sacred ground. I could simply just tell you what was there, what happened, what I saw, but I wouldn't
Yes.
I just present it.
My main memory of reading Kate's first draft was I had a passionate argument with her about whether cellos could feel anything, or whether cellos could in any way be anthropomorphized, or could in any way take on the memory of the music they had played. And I would be going all the way through this book going, really? What?
This is another angle on how close is too close. How close are you to a cello?
Whereas in fact, these were the bits of the book everybody adored, so I was completely wrong about
my favourite editorial comment of all time is, my eyebrows are up to my hairline. Brilliant.
You took it well. You took it very well. Yes. I mean, it can get ridiculous, this the question. There's a nice example of over-identification in Richard Holmes, who I mentioned before, when he was beginning work on his great Life of Shelley in 1972. And he said, I marked my beginning as a professional biographer from the day when my bank bounced a cheque because it was inadvertently dated 1772. I love that.
I've done that with the First World War.
Exactly, we've all
1912.
done that. Yeah. But there are some really eyebrow-raising examples of people going too far, getting too close, possibly. I mean, I was very scared by Lyndall Gordon, the fine biographer Lyndall Gordon, telling me that she had spent the night in Henry James's bed in his house in Rye while she was writing a version of Henry James's life. And I thought, that's a bit too close, really.
Was she wearing his pyjamas at the time?
Doesn't say. And there's the classic story of this is the biographer of Graham Greene, poor old Norman Sherry, who followed in his subject's footsteps for 30 years, writing 3 volumes and 2,500 pages, in which he tried to insert himself into every corner of Graham Greene's life. And this, the result was an actually magisterial biography, but also a bit of a disaster, because a lot of the critics said too much Sherry. And he kept featuring in the photographs of Graham Greene that were in the
It's like photo bombing.
He thought it was a little bit too much. And it was a disaster for him, too, because he followed Graham Greene to Mexico and Liberia and Cuba and Vietnam and Haiti and the Congo, and he developed gangrene and went temporarily blind and had to have part of his intestines removed. Now, I'm as dedicated as the next really person to writing biography, but I sort of think there are limits on what you can... And apparently Graham Greene, I only discovered this recently, Graham Greene said to Norman Sherry that he, Graham Greene, would not live to see Volume 2, and that he, Norman Sherry, would never live to see Volume 3. That he would have exhausted himself so much that he would have died before. So Norman Sherry never wrote the last sentence of the book because he was so terrified.
It's like finishing your 9th symphony, isn't it?
Exactly.
Yeah. How funny.
And then there are some pretty soppy, I have to say, minor examples of biographers overwrite. There's a recent book called The World According to Joan Didion by a writer called Evelyn MacDonnell, published a couple of years ago. And it starts like, it sets up the case for her identification with Didion like this. She was born within 1 year of my mother. I was born within 2 years of her daughter. We are both native daughters of California. We lived in New York at the same time, though she was an Upper East Side celebrity and I was a Lower East Side punkette. We both wrote in order to live. We both thought about the sea whenever we felt troubled. And an unkind, in my view, deservedly unkind review of this book by Lynn Barber began, Soul Sisters, right? And there's a problem there. And then there's a book I read called Mrs. Gaskell and Me, by a writer called Nell Stevens in 2018. I hope these people are not the best friends of people in the room. Mrs. Gaskell was always demanding letters from her loved ones and complaining if the replies she received were too short. I still feel a pang, something like lovesickness, when I think that Mrs. Gaskell and I can't write to each other. We would write such good letters, I think. We would have so much to say. I mean, there are good examples of involvement. I mean, there are some wonderful books by people like Olivia Laing and Lara Feigl and Julia Blackman, really fine examples. Yep. But that sort of thing really sticks in my craw, actually, because I feel you don't have the right.
Yeah.
You don't have the right to claim that kind of closeness.
And how do you stop yourself getting in the way of your story? What sort of objective perspective can you have when it is, we would have been such friends, so we're soulmates? How can you stand back and observe?
What did you do with your emotions about Ivor Gurney when you were writing very much not yourself in the picture, but writing about a desperately painful and difficult, which you could perhaps briefly...
So in 2021, I think, I wrote a biography. It was many, many years in the writing, of the First World War poet and composer, very unusually, equally brilliant at both, called Ivor Gurney. And he is one of those people who did need reclaiming. So there was, perhaps unlike with Woolf, there wasn't a huge body of biographies. There was one very, very small biography by a composer who'd meant to write it with a literary critic, and then for some reason that never happened. So it's 50% of a biography. So there was a very sort of strong sense that this was the account of Gurney. And I'd spent years and years and years in the archives looking at both the music and the literature. And also, particularly for me, there was a real moral imperative to write, not because I thought we'd be best friends, but because he had been confined to a lunatic asylum, as it was then, for most of his adult life, 4 years after coming back from the trenches until he died there in 1937. So most of his adult work was written from within an asylum, lots and lots of it, the vast majority still unpublished. So I was finding all this major 20th century work in two genres for the first time, where pretty much nobody apart from Gurney had seen it before. And there was no money from the estate because obviously he wasn't able to leave it with any. So there was a huge sense that I had this direct line to him. I was seeing so much of his work for the first time that nobody else would see, and it was my responsibility to come up with the narrative of this song or this poem or whatever it was. And yet this man is so entirely different from me in so many ways. I have no first-hand experience of fighting in the trenches. He was schizophrenic, had schizoaffective disorder, whatever we would now call it, and that's a very complicated area. But a lot of the time he believed in the asylum that he was Brahms or Schubert. At one point, he believes that the machines under the floor are torturing him, and he believes that he's been inserted into the anus of a policeman, which is thinking about how far we would go for recreating our subject's experience. I draw the line well before that. But poor Gurney. So palpably, we are not the same person. I'm not just writing someone in whom I see myself, but I absolutely have a very strong moral obligation to do the best I can to be able to understand what it was like to be him.
And as you explored the story and began to write it, was there affect? Did you feel that awful question that biographers get, did you like him? Did you feel close? I don't mean close to him, because you've just explained why not, but did you feel some empathy for him or some sense of wanting to do him justice? Does that arise?
Yeah, a very, very, very strongly wanting to do him justice, whatever that would mean. But he wasn't, he was a lovable egotist, as his best friend, the composer Herbert Howells, described him, but he wasn't that likeable a character. He was an extremely difficult man. And I found the moments where I felt closest to him were actually reading his medical records and seeing the doctors observing him, sometimes very coldly. So at one point he was given malaria as an experiment to see if the paroxysms would purge the madness. And they didn't. And the medical note is very small, written in tiny handwriting. It says something like, the patient has lost 2 stone in weight, is on his knees praying for death, no improvement. And at moments like that, I felt terribly close. But there was also one thing, thinking about our Lives of Houses collection, and revisiting the places and what we find and what we don't find. When I was writing the book, I went to Dartford Asylum, the City of London mental hospital, which is just over the Dartford Bridge, and it's the most grim. It's everything you'd want from a disused asylum, sort of crumbling Victorian edifice, bats flying around it. It was starting to rain. It was dark. There were no leaves on the trees. It was near Christmas, and it was as bleak as it could possibly be. And then after I published the book, I went back with the BBC crew and made a documentary about Gurney. And by that point, it took me a while to get the book out, it had been completely revamped. It had been turned into luxury commuter accommodation. And I went round with the archivist of the asylum as if it was a kind of public school open day. And by the end of this day with the BBC crew, with her showing us all these lovely places, I felt like I wanted to sign up and live there as well. It was the most bizarre double think about what this place has meant to me in the space of 5 years, something that is this kind of gothic horror setting to really rather smart and looks quite fun.
That's one of those examples where Footsteps is very misleading.
Absolutely.
Had you not been there before.
Yeah.
When you got to the end, let's think a little bit about endings. I mean, when you got to the end of the Gurney book, was it a challenge to write the ending, to write his last days, to write what happened to him at the end? Did you do it with a clinical lump of ice in your heart, like the doctors doing the reports, or?
No, that was very emotional. And I think one of the things that was interesting there is that his voice peters out. For quite a few years before his death, he's got to the point where he's lost in his own story. He's somewhere else mentally entirely. And he becomes thinner and thinner and more ill, and I'm relying on medical accounts and friends visiting him, and there were very few who did. And then on the account of his funeral, which was very beautiful, and so that was tremendously moving, and just the fact that I think particularly it was about landscape and place. The fact that for 15 years he'd been shut off from the landscape that he lived for. He'd lived to write about Gloucestershire. He knew the details of every leaf of every path. At one point, Edward Thomas's widow brought some Ordnance Survey maps into his cell in the asylum that Edward Thomas had walked the paths of Gloucestershire before he was killed in the war. And Gurney came alive, having barely spoken, and followed these paths with his fingers. And it was only in his coffin that he actually returned to Gloucestershire, to that landscape. And so that, for me, was tremendously moving.
But it's so interesting, isn't it, what you do with your emotions when you're writing. I mean, most of the people in this room are writing in some way or other, and how you channel those emotions or control them. And I read a piece a long time ago called How to End It All, which is in a collection about life writing called Body Parts. And it was about why, I'm so curious about why do we go on with that Christian tradition, which has been so influential on Western biography, of investing the death of the subject with some kind of import or meaning, why we find it quite hard when we get to the end of a narrative simply to say that it's the next thing that happened. The great late Edmund White, when writing about Genet, called to de-dramatize it, to not make it be an ending which contains huge amounts of meaning and import.
There's a biography of Catherine Mansfield which begins about the first 30 pages with the death, with this kind of dramatically awful coughing up blood. But her death would be the only bit of her life she really wouldn't have recognised, wouldn't it? Which always struck me as a bizarre, defining shadow across the story.
As Woolf said, it's the one thing I shan't be able to write about.
Yeah.
And quite often biographies begin with the death. Actually, I remember Peter Ackroyd beginning his life of Dickens with the death of Dickens, and had all his characters cluster around him on his deathbed, which is, that's a one way of writing biography. That's a kind of imaginative way of doing it. But it is something to consider, and when we teach life writing, I quite often like to set 5 deathbed scenes of the same person against each other and see how different people have dealt with it. It's a bit different when you're writing about a living subject.
How was that? So, Dave, the same question back to you. How close did you feel to Woolf? How did you feel when you killed her off?
Oh, well, yes.
And how do you deal with not having killed Tom Stoppard?
I had been, I'll tell one story and maybe I'll read a paragraph, and then we can, and then you want to talk about afterlife. So yes, I've been working on Virginia Woolf for about 5 years, and I was living in my husband's house in Yorkshire, and I had some time off teaching. And he was going out to work every day at the University of Leeds, and I was staying at home with Virginia Woolf. And one day he came home, and I came down the stairs, and I was crying. And he said, "What's the matter?" And I said, "Well, I killed her today. She's dead." And he went, "Yay!" There is, of course, when you finish, when you get to the end, there is, of course, a slight tinge of relief. But I think one mustn't let that into the writing. But when I was writing about Tom Stoppard, who happily and thankfully is a living subject, a very living subject, I decided to end with that question. And shall I just read
please.
that? And then
Yeah.
come back? So this is how that, I haven't got a copy of the book here, sorry. How is this to end? You cannot end the written life of a living subject, nor can you ever tell the whole story. It's not just that the processes of biography, collecting, shaping, and selecting, are quite different from how a person actually lives their life. It's that outside and beyond the writing is the physical presence of the person, the sound of their voice, the look in their eye, the drama of their personality, the emotions they arouse, their silences and mysteries, the things they haven't told you, and that you will never know about them. You try to bring the person to life as fully as you can on your page, your stage of written words. But in the end, this person, Tom Stoppard, will vanish into the darkness, and all those things that made this person who he was will vanish with him. He will live on in his work. You will find him there as he has always wanted you to. Once he vanishes, he becomes his admirers. His life turns into the work he has left behind and into other people's stories, legends, anecdotes, and versions of him, of which this book is one. What I have tried to capture will only ever be one aspect of him. The relation of the written to the lived life can only be partial. The biographer's problem reminds me of a story Stoppard has often told when talking about plays and playwriting, of an open-air production of The Tempest, staged by the lake in the gardens of an Oxford college, it's actually Worcester College, in the late 1950s. He used this example for one of his favourite themes, that what the writer brings to the theatre is only a small part of what happens in the lived moment of the play. The magic of theatre can be created through many other things than words, and this is Stoppard writing about that production. When it became time for Ariel to leave the action of the play, he turned and he ran up the stage away from the audience. Now, the stage was a lawn, and the lawn backed onto a lake. He ran across the grass and got to the edge of the lake, and he just kept running, because the director had had the foresight to put a plank walkway just underneath the surface of the water. So you have to imagine, it's become dusk and quite a lot of the artificial lighting has come on, and back there in the gloom is this lake. And Ariel says his last words, and he turns and he runs and gets to the water, and he runs and he goes splish, splash, right across the lake and into the enfolding dark until one can only just hear his footsteps making these little splashes. And then ultimately his little figure disappeared from view. And at that moment, from the further shore, a firework rocket was ignited and just went whoosh into the sky and burst into lots of sparks. All the sparks went out one by one, and Ariel had gone. Here's the thing. You can't write anything as good as that. When you look it up, it says, "Exit Ariel."
Brilliant.
So then there's the afterlife.
Yes. Oh, my goodness. So with Cello, I was following the stories of four particular people. It's a kind of quartet of biographies. But one story loomed very large, which was the story of a wonderful cellist composer called Paul Herrmann, who was a Jewish cellist who was killed in the Holocaust, and his cello was rescued in an amazing daredevil burglary, but then lost in the 50s. And I spent the whole book looking for this cello all over internationally, had hundreds of people on the search, and failed to find it by the time I had to just admit that it wasn't going to happen, and I had to hand the manuscript in, and that was that. So the hardback is an account of me failing to find this cello. Talking about living subjects, his daughter still is in her late 90s, and I was working very closely with her, and I dearly wanted her to be able to hear the sound of her father's cello after 85 years and hear his music played again on it. And then because of publishing the book, because there was so much detail about the hunt and of so many photographs and so much to give people to go on, that it wasn't possible to convey before publication, the cello was found a week before the book launch. And it was a huge news story, and it was wonderful. And the poor unsuspecting chap who didn't know the special story behind the cello he was playing flew over from Dusseldorf to play for us as a surprise at the Wigmore Hall. And Corrie, the 96-year-old daughter, was there in the audience, and it was wonderful.
It was amazing. It was an amazing event.
It was pretty special. Couldn't have made it up. But then that took on its own story as well. So then the European Parliament picked up the story, and the President invited us to go and represent the Holocaust to, I think, the 70th anniversary of the liberation of the camps in January. And again, that was all over Reuters, and it was kind of internationally broadcast. And so what I had no idea about was that this story would grow bigger after publication than it was by the point at which I published it.
Was it in time for the paperback?
Yes, there's a whole new chapter of the paperback going, oh, by the way, about that cello.
Yes. Actually, this is pretty unusual. There can't be many pieces of life writing which have that kind of coda to them.
It's
wonderful
absolutely
to hear that story.
In life. But the other thing as well, that just to circle right back to where we began with a kind of squeamish, revealing my arm injury sob story. But having been so extremely reluctant to do that, the very unexpected afterlife that I have now found is that I now have daily, in fact, people from all over the world contacting me saying, I damaged my lip as a French horn player, and I've never been able to listen to music since. I couldn't bear it, but I've read your book, and now I want my story to be heard. Or my father played the piano, but then when he sawed his finger off, he couldn't play anymore, and we had to sell the piano because he couldn't bear to look at it. And so it was all these endlessly.
Don't you think there's a book here?
There probably
think there's a Oxford Centre for Life Writing anthology
called
Musical Recoveries.
Yes.
How about that?
Well, I made a Radio 3 series called Healing Musicians, which was 5 of these stories. But they just keep coming. So now, and now the sort of British Medical Journal are asking about it, and there are various sort of musical charities as well, for which I now give talks about musicians and injuries, because there's a huge stigma around it. You know, it's always, well, your technique's a bit rubbish, or you were never going to be up to it, so therefore that's why you're saying, well, I would have been a genius, but, it's... and so that is a completely different afterlife, and it's a very interesting one when we think about how much of ourselves to reveal, because if I had been as squeamish as I would have been, none of that would have happened. Yes. So it has a completely unexpected life.
I think that's a wonderful story. I think there might be a few questions in the time we have.
And I think there will be a roving mic.
Can we bring up the lights, perhaps, as well, Charles? Thank you. Great. As long as they're not too personal.
Hermione.
Yes.
How can you be truly honest about a subject who is still alive, and you have your own view on, you either like them or you don't like them very much, or they're concealing something from you? How does that work?
Yes, good question. I got lucky because I had been asked to do this book by the subject, which in a way is both, it frees you up, because if they've asked you, then they presumably are going to trust you. But it also, of course, might confine you if this were a different kind of person. But I remember telling Stoppard what Beckett had said to Deirdre Bear when she started work on his first biography. Beckett said to her, "I will neither help nor hinder." Fascinating. And Stoppard said to me, "Well, I'll help and I won't hinder." So that was the the relationship, it was a helpful one. I'm sure there were things he didn't tell me, absolutely sure. But you can only work with what you've got, and you don't only talk to your subject. I mean, one of the things that you necessarily do, as I'm sure you'll know, is talk to as many possible living witnesses as you can find. One of the problems with Stoppard is that he's a nice guy, and I spent a lot of time trying to find someone who would say something unpleasant about him. It was quite a struggle, actually. I did get Peter Nichols, who's notoriously jealous of Stoppard, and in fact put him in as a fictional character into one of his books where his name is Miles Whittier, which tells you what Nichols felt about Stoppard. So he gave me an embargo. He said, I don't want you to write about the boys. He has 4 grown-up sons, one of whom's a well-known actor called Ed Stoppard. And they all got their life problems and their complexities. So I thought that was fair enough. I thought, if you're the son of a famous playwright, why should you be exposed in a biography about your dad? So I put them in when they were little boys, because Tom Stoppard as a dad is an important part of the story, actually. And then I just let them go, unless they happen to be acting in one of his plays, in which case I would mention it. And the time came when we had a contractual relationship, which was properly authorised by our agent. Happened to be the same agent, so that was helpful. And the contract was that he would correct me on matters of fact, but that he would provide me with all materials that he could. And about a third of the way into my writing, he said, I found the letters that I wrote to my mother. They seem to have got lost, but I've found them. Would you like to look at them? Yes. And I thought there'd be maybe a small packet of schoolboy letters. So Stoppard had written to his mother once a week, every week, from 1948 until she died in 1996. Many of these letters were not dated, but some of them had envelopes, so it was possible to date from the postmark. But that meant I had to start again, really. And I know that he knew where those letters were all the time.
I think you were on probation.
But, I was on
going to allow you to
probation.
see them.
I was on probation. So that was a bit of a challenge. But then when we got to the final moment, when I went to the house and he had my considerably large manuscript in front of him with lots and lots and lots of little yellow Post-it notes in it for matters of fact. And we turned every page. I was quite, nervous. And there was one thing he asked me to take up, which was that in a revival of one of his plays, one of the actors had turned out to be no good, turned out to be miscast, and he'd had to be got rid of. And Stoppard had been involved in that process, as he always is very involved in the new productions of his plays. He talks about, I have to look after my play. And I put that anecdote in for that reason, because I thought it was interesting about how hands-on he is, and I'd named the actor. And Stoppard got to that page and he said, do you have to name him? And I took it out. I thought, that's a mensch, That was the only thing. I'd found love letters he didn't know still existed to his first teenage love object. Incredibly mawkish and soppy and self-indulgent teenage love letters. He didn't blink.
And affairs with extremely well-known celebrities.
Well, those were mostly known about.
But even so, difficult material.
So that's a sort of anecdotal answer to your question. I was lucky. I mean, there are stories of biographers of living subjects who do not get lucky. Yes. Thank you. This one. Oh, okay. And then this one. Yeah, you. Yes.
Okay.
And then there's one.
I guess this is a bit of a logistical question for Kate. I was just wondering, with your sort of quest narrative, which sounds so fascinating, how do you sort of start with that one idea and then turn it into such a sort of large-scale research project? I don't know how close to hold the mic, sorry.
How do you start with one idea?
Could everyone hear that?
So,
how do you start with the question, then turn it into a huge research
project from one little research question? I think it grew incrementally quite quickly. I'm trying to think back to how it actually started. I think I started with the idea that I wanted to explore the instrument. I wanted to fall back in love with the instrument. It was a complicated relationship. In fact, it really started with me having a publicity photo taken and feeling kind of gauche and awkward because these things are really awful. And then the photographer saying, well, go and get your cello. And I did, but I wasn't sure because I didn't need a photograph of the cello particularly. But as soon as I had the cello, my silhouette was complete. And I was not the least bit worried about being photographed. With the cello, I was whole. And so that was my starting point. So taking that example and then finding other cellists whose relationship was in some way complicated. So Julian Lloyd Webber, brother of Andrew Lloyd Webber, who's had a problem with his neck, which has ruined his international career as a soloist, talking to him about that. And then he will say, but you must meet my friend so-and-so. And then, and of course, a bit of Googling and other stories, thinking back through Jacqueline Dupre, but also the wanting to understand the instrument, so making a cello, finding out about the history of Stradivarius and the kind of secret history of instrument varnish and going to Cremona and then bumping into an instrument maker in the Cremona Instrument Museum, and he took me to his mentor who was a leading luthier who told me more stories, and he took me to someone else. And so there was a lot of rambling around. I think at one point Hermione said, obviously, of course, your research in Paris didn't really just involve turning up randomly at instrument shops, and it really did.
But
I love the fact you give me more credit than that.
How did you decide which cellos to use? Because you must have at some point gone down all kinds of pathways and found lots of other possible cellos. So you must have had at some point to select your 4 or 5 instruments that you were going to concentrate on as part of that.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's 30,000 words of book that never made it into the book, which are lots of other stories as well. I think sometimes stories just take on a life of their own. And I was very much, having worked so intensively in the archives of one person and shaping a very traditional biography, I was very much up for a kind of convalescent book after the best part of 16 years on and off on Gurney, of just following a thread and seeing where it goes. And seeing what I could find in these places and seeing who I could meet and seeing where that took me. And so some stories just sort of fizzled out or there wasn't enough, and others grew incrementally. So then I was thinking about balancing them and, men versus women and time periods and what the stories were and who survives and who doesn't, so it's not too intensely depressing. And so a kind of form and structure balancing, but also where the stories really caught fire, basically.
Did you shift the order around
a lot?
Yeah.
And it's told geographically, so the stories are all intertwined depending on where I am in Europe. So you follow me finding the different stories at different times.
I think that's also something that's part of this turning the original idea into into a big research project, into a big book. It's everyone knows this. It's a lot to do with structure, isn't it?
Hugely.
It's a lot to do with deciding, the point where you have to kill your darlings, and you spent 3 months finding something, and then actually it's not working, has to go. That's a painful thing, and also just balancing acts of, as you say, getting the tone right and getting the balance right. There's one here, yes.
Thank you.
Is this on? Yeah.
Okay. This is going back to what you were saying right in the beginning about the reluctance to put I in the story. And I do agree with you, Kate, that it's an English thing. It's when I was in a working class upbringing in England, the biggest insult that you could say to anybody is you're big-headed.
Big-headed.
Big-headed,
yes, absolutely.
It's terrible.
Or too big for your boots.
Yes.
So what I'm just wondering, do you see it as a paradox? I was just thinking as I was thinking about the question, if it is a paradox. On the other hand, England as a character is huge ego in the world in terms of colonization. And I've always felt a bit embarrassed by saying, you don't talk about yourself, when England in the world is incredibly entitled and big-headed.
I mean, the first thing that occurs to me about that is something rather frivolous in a way, which is the manners of empire are have a lot to do with that tradition of the stiff upper lip and not giving your emotions away. So I suppose there's a weird convergence of that sort of English, let's not spill all our emotions, and the way in which the empire was governed for that period of time. It's about, here are all these native people all emoting all over the place, and we're this tiny tribe of governors who are doing it through, self-restraint and self-discipline and all that. I guess that's part of the plot. But I think that I actually think this whole thing about English reticence and has gone out the window, really. I mean, if you think about social media and certain kinds of programs and the way everybody weeps all the time. You can't watch a single program on television without people weeping, Oh, where are my ancestors? Where are my roots? Oh, I've just discovered my great-grandmother. I'm sorry, but, I feel, come on.
Didn't you cry at my book launch?
I did cry at your book launch. Yes.
For good reason, that was tremendously moving.
Oh, there, hi.
I'm going to ask you to pass it on.
First of all, can I say thank you to both of you? It's been absolutely fascinating. The two different angles that you're coming from and all these many stories is really wonderful. But I was really thinking also about the egotism, which you've been talking about, and this fashion for weeping and all the rest of it. And also photographing your breakfast. I mean, I was wondering how this generation of young, aspiring biographers, I mean, how you could avoid being personal. I mean, there's such a sort of pressure on people to do that as a badge of authenticity. And I think the sort of style of biography that you're talking about, Hermione, in which you and I also emerged, was to follow a sort of Victorian authoritative voice, wasn't it? Where you didn't mention the first person pronoun, and so you aspired to and you acquired to a certain degree a type of authority. Yeah. Through not mentioning yourself. Whereas if you don't mention yourself these days, it looks as if you're inauthentic. Yes. And I think it must just be very hard for a young person to have the choice. You don't really have much choice anymore.
Yeah. This is a great biographer, Claire Harmon, I should say. I think it is a generational thing, and I think it is also enormously much to do with the pressure from publishing houses, and they're now in that loop where you pretty much got to tell your own story as well as the story of the person. Maybe it will pass. I don't know.
Or maybe it will. Maybe the structures will change as a result. So I think it can be very interesting if you use it well, and it can open up possibilities. But to use it as a blanket way of writing, it's got to be about me before it's about someone else,
But Claire's point about, if we were 25 and trying to sell our first book, how would we argue the case for objectivity or for reserve or for self-disguise? And I think you're right. I think at the moment it would be very hard to do. It would be very hard to make that pitch. And maybe it's fine. Maybe I'm just representing the dinosaurs of biography. Those days are done. Maybe those days are done.
But also perhaps if you have a particular authority to tell a story, being able to show that this is the story of my mother, this is the story of someone that you have a particular right to tell, can be important. Perhaps it can become useful that we know something about the person before we trust their voice. Don't know. But then also perhaps it's limiting. Perhaps if you don't have a particular claim to a story, people will now want to know why you think you have the right to tell it. And
I like this ambivalence. I think we should keep the doors open. I think we should go on saying there are no rules for biography. There are no rules for life writing. You do what moves you and what inspires you and what sends you in a particular direction. And if you don't want to say I, good for you. And if you do want to say I, then make it real and, keep it strong. Anyway, should we go and have a drink?
Yes, that sounds like a good rallying cry.
Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you all very much.